Hello boys and girls, and welcome back to another episode of Ushanka Show. Let's learn together something new about life in the Soviet Union. Today we're going to talk again about Soviet education and Soviet schools, and just a friendly reminder, if you're interested in that topic, I have a separate playlist called Soviet Education. It has already 37 videos, and I'll provide the link below in the comment section. Recently I got the question from Jacob Preen asking, unrelated to this video, but how did the Soviet Union teach the history of the Russian Empire? And before we begin, let's have a quick refresher on the Soviet education system. So Soviet children went to school at the age of 7, and we went to school for 10 years. So you're out of school at the age of 17. And we went to school 6 days a week. So kids went to school every day but Sunday. We began studying history at the 5th grade, so at the age of 11. And it began with the history of the ancient world. This is the cover of the history book, as I remember. And we had history lessons twice a week for 45 minutes. In the 6th grade, we moved to the history of the Middle Ages, История средних веков, and you see the book cover. And once again, we had 2 lessons a week for 45 minutes each. By the way, I forgot to mention that while in school, I always enjoyed, well, it's a little bit too strong of the word, let's say, I always liked history lessons. I generally enjoyed history, had a good memory. So I always scored excellent or 5, отлично, in history, and that's from year after year. I always had excellent scores. And this is the cover of history book for the 7th grade, and it probably looks extremely confusing to any foreigner because the book actually says История СССР, USSR history. Okay, Kremlin, sure, Moscow, capital of the USSR, but who are those comrades? If it's the history of the USSR, who are those Soviet leaders? They definitely don't look Soviet, right? So going back to the original question, how did Soviet Union teach the history of the Russian Empire? So here's your first clue. This is actually the textbook for history of Russia, but it's called USSR history. So here you go. The history of Russian Empire was considered a part of history of the Soviet Union, like it's pretty much foundation. And now a fun fact for you guys. Between 1923 and 1932, Soviet pupils, students had no history lessons at school at all. So back then, it was pretty much we closed the door to the history of Imperial Russia. It was just something we left behind, and we started something brand new. And I believe it was Comrade Stalin who made the sharp U-turn towards embracing the history of Russia, and it happened on November 7th, 1941. And if you remember, in November of 1941, Germans were at the gates of Moscow, so Soviet Union was at its lowest point during the Great Patriotic War of 1941-1945. During his speech dedicated to the 24th anniversary of October Revolution of 1917, Comrade Stalin mentioned people that had nothing to do with October Revolution. He said the following: "Let the courageous images of our great ancestors Alexander Nevsky, Dmitry Donskoy, Kuzma Minin, Dmitry Pozharsky, Alexander Suvorov, Mikhail Kutuzov inspire you in this war." So it seems like by November of 1941, 4 months after Germany attacked Soviet Union on June 22nd, Stalin realized that soldiers of the Red Army are not getting really inspired to fight under slogans of international communism and stuff like that. And suddenly Comrade Stalin recalled the images of great Russian, not Soviet ancestors and military leaders like Alexander Nevsky and Dmitry Donskoy. And of course, this new direction was instantly picked up by the Soviet propaganda machine, and thousands of posters were printed with images of those Russian heroes and a quote by Stalin. And even on the postcards, instead of familiar faces of Comrade Lenin, Marx and Engels, we suddenly see these bearded guys in old-fashioned military outfits. And this is Dmitry Pozharsky, and below the same quote by Иосиф Stalin. «Пусть вдохновляет вас в этой войне мужественный образ наших великих предков». And on May 24, 1945, during the victory banquet in Kremlin, Moscow, Stalin confirmed that he is done with international socialism. He had a toast, and he said that the Russian nation is the one that won the Great Patriotic War, and he toasted for the health of the Russian nation. So maybe that's explained why history of Russia was actually called History of the Soviet Union in the Soviet schools. Okay, my friends, I apologize for this detour. I'm aware that sometimes it makes my videos long and boring, but I thought it was important to mention that part. And now, boys and girls, quiz time! Please pause this video, take a close look at these 4 people on the book cover, and type in the comment section the names of these 4 important Russian people. I trust you won't cheat, you won't use Google, so just see how much you know about history of Russia. And just to make you feel better, or maybe not, I knew 3 of them. The last person, I had no idea, I had to search. Okay, and now let's check your homework. I truly hope that you guys posted in the comment section your replies. So first person is Stepan or Stenka Razin. He was a Cossack from Don region, and he led a major uprising rebellion against the nobility and Tsarist bureaucracy in southern Russia back in 1670 and 1671. Number 2, Mikhail or Mikhailo Lomonosov, who was a Russian polymath, scientist, and writer who made important contributions to literature, education, and science. Among his discoveries were the atmosphere of Venus and the law of conservation of mass in chemical reactions. His spheres of science were natural science, chemistry, physics, mineralogy, history, art, theology, optical devices, and others. He was a founder of modern geology. He was also a poet and influenced the formation of modern Russian literature language. Number 3, Alexander Suvorov. And by the way, if you guys are interested to learn more about these people, I'll post links for the Wikipedia articles before in the comment section. So Alexander Suvorov was one of the foremost generals of all of military history and considered the greatest military commander in Russian history. Suvorov has been compared to Napoleon in military generalship. Undefeated, he has been described as the best general Republican France ever fought, and noted as one of those rare generals who were consistently successful despite suffering from considerable disadvantages. Suvorov was also admired by his soldiers throughout his whole military life and was respected for his honest service and truthfulness. To be honest, that description sounds almost too good to be truth, and recently there is some information started coming out that Alexander Suvorov wasn't as good as described in Wikipedia. And I would like to ask my Polish viewers, because Alexander Suvorov was in Poland with 25,000 troops fighting Polish insurgents back in 1794-95. And finally, number 4, Alexander Nikolaevich Radishchev. And if you didn't recognize him, don't feel bad. I had the same problem. I actually had to ask around. Thank God right now it's so easy having internet. So he was a Russian author and social critic who was arrested and exiled under Catherine the Great. He brought the tradition of radicalism in Russian literature with his 1790 novel Journey from St. Petersburg to Moscow. His depiction of socioeconomic conditions in Russia resulted in his exile in Siberia until 1797. And that book is available in English translation. I looked it up. It's priced pretty decently on eBay, a little bit more expensive on Amazon. So you can find that book. I didn't want to read it when I was in school. It sounded really boring, but right now I'm interested to read it. And a quick recap. So we have on the cover a leader of Peasants' Rebellion, Stenka Razin, famous Russian scientist Mikhailo Lomonosov, famous Russian military commander Alexander Suvorov, and one of the famous Russian writers, Alexander Radishchev. I'm very surprised that they picked just these 4. Of course, it's my personal opinion, but I believe Alexander Pushkin, the famous Russian poet, he was way more famous and well-known than Alexander Radishchev, and he is instantly recognized by everyone. So I'm not sure why they decided to put Radishchev on the cover, not Pushkin, except that Radishchev actually show some rebellion and he was exiled. So maybe that's the reason. And I'm totally shocked that Peter the Great didn't make on the cover of History of Russia, because he's the guy who actually came up with this term Russia, Россия. Before his time, it was called Moscovia, Moskovskое царство, and he wanted to call it Russian Empire, Российская империя, and instead of a Tsar, he wanted to be called the Emperor, Imperator. And he should be on the cover for the history of Russia, but he's not. By the way, Soviet history textbook had several editions, so they were updated over the years. So this is the cover of the older edition. We still have Alexander Suvorov, military commander. We have still Alexander Radishchev, the writer. But instead of Stenka Razin, here's the picture of Yemельyan Pugachev. That's another leader of Peasants' Rebellion. And here's another cover for, I believe that will be the newest edition of the history of the Soviet Union, aka History of Russia. And here we have 5 people, so Yemельyan Pugachev is included. Okay, so Yemельyan Ivanovich Pugachev, born 1742, executed in 1775. He was a Cossack ataman, so leader, and a leader of the Pugachev Rebellion, major popular uprising in the Russian Empire during the reign of Catherine the Great. Once again, Catherine the Great was the part of his story. And speaking of different editions, this particular book that we discussed in length in this video, it was the 10th edition published in Moscow in 1975. Okay, so let's take a quick look how the Russian history was presented in the Soviet-era history book. Okay, so first 28 pages were dedicated for первобытно-общинный строй и рабовладельческий строй в истории нашей страны. So, primitive times and slavery times in the history of our country, and also ancient Slav people, then also settlements of the tribal communities, as well as slavery states in Caucasian region and Middle Asia, people of northern Black Sea area in ancient times, as well as last number 5 paragraph is Eastern Slavs in ancient times. It sounds more like a college topics, right? But this is what we had to study being 13, 14-year-olds in the 7th grade. All right, chapter 2, it's early feudal state, Kievan, Russia, 19th century to the 12th century, creating of classes in Eastern Slav tribes, creation of ancient Russian state, древнерусское государство, developing of feudal relations, people's uprising, and culture of ancient Russia. So that's another 20 pages. Fun fact, the term Kievskaya Rus or Kievan Russia or Kievan Rus was invented in 19th century, so it has nothing to do with actual history. It was invented many years later by Russian historians. And chapter 3 talks about feudal fragmentation, феодальная раздробленность на территории нашей страны, on the territory of our country. So Soviet Union doesn't exist yet, but we're going to talk about feudal fragmentation on the territory of the future Soviet Union. We're also going to learn about development of feudalism in Transcaucasia, development of feudal relationship in the Middle Asia, and then the interesting part, the beginning of Mongol invasion. And here I notice an interesting language switch. So when it comes to the struggle against Mongolian invasion, they talk about борьба русского народа. So now it's the Russian nation is fighting against Mongol Tatars, not just like dukes and their armies. And number 20 then later goes struggle once again of Russian nation and nations of Baltic states against Swedish and German feudals. And once again, number 21, nations of Ukraine, Belarus, and Lithuania in a struggle against aggression of the German feudals. So you see the language switches now. It's the nations fighting against dukes or whatever the feudals are, not just Russian feudals against German feudals. I hate that word, feudalic. So it's interesting how the writers of this book carefully connect Russian nation, Russian people with nations of Baltic states, Pribaltica they call it, so that's Estonians, Lithuanians, and Latvians. So they together fight against Swedes or Germans, although I believe Swedes are way closer to Baltic nations than Russians. But here, that's opposite theme is being pushed. And in the next chapter, chapter 4, they talk about creation and development of the Russian centralized state, the reason it was created, the time when Moscow started rising in 14th century, Kulikovskaya battle, and then uniting Russian lands in a single state. And the most interesting and important is number 28, присоединение к российскому государству Поволжья и Западной Сибири. So this is kind of language they always used about expansion of Russian state, or Russia or Moscovia state. They never said that Russia occupied or captured territories. It was always присоединение, so it's almost like annexation, but it's an even gentler word. You just attach to your territory next territory. So this is attachment to the Russian state Volga region, which wasn't, of course, peaceful, and Western Siberia. And I don't know how many of you caught that phrase of Vladimir Putin when he had an interview with Tucker Carlson. He claimed that Russia безболезненно впитывала народы. So Russia painlessly absorbed other nations. So that's kind of whole theme, that we never were fighting and killing people. We just painlessly absorbed other nations, year after year, century after century, and that's how Russia became the largest country in the world. And another fine example in chapter 6, number 36, угнетение украинского белорусского народов польскими феодалами, the oppression of Ukrainian and Belarusian nations by Polish feudals. And this theme continues in the next chapter, number 37, освободительная война украинского белорусского народов против польских феодалов. So it's a liberation war of Ukrainian and Belarusian nations against Polish feudals. So it's always our good guys, our nations fighting not Polish nation, but they're fighting only Polish feudals, feodali. And then воссоединение Украины с Россией. So that's the same chapter. It's when Ukraine signed the agreement with Russia, although Putin said Ukraine did not exist till 1922. Here they talk in Ukraine existed back in, I believe, was it 1454. That's when the agreement was signed between Bogdan Khmelnytsky and the Russian Tsar. As I mentioned earlier in this video, I always had excellent grades in history lessons, but because the way they taught Russian history in the Soviet schools, I discovered I had quite a few, would call it blind spots, when it came to specific events. For example, so-called Crimean War of 1854, I couldn't recall who won and who lost that war. I didn't remember that Russia won, but I didn't remember that Russia lost as well. So that was kind of an interesting situation there. And when I was trying to recall the events of Crimean War of 1854, all I could remember were names of specific Russian heroes that performed excellently during the siege of Sevastopol. Like there was this famous sailor, Pyotr Koshkin, and he was sneaking at night to the French or British positions and, stealing soldiers there. So he was like a hero and he was promoted heavily. There was famous military surgeon Nikolai Pirogov, so his last name stuck in my mind, as well as Admiral Nahimov. So I remembered people, but I didn't remember the results of that war. This is how history was presented in Soviet schools. And here's another example for you. So I always knew that Russia used to own or occupy Poland for over 100 years. And Poland became independent again after collapse of Russian Empire in 1917. But I couldn't remember how Russia managed to occupy Poland. There was definitely no war between Poland and Russia where Russia won. But I did basic math, 1917 minus 100, it's around 1812-ish, right? So then I realized when Napoleon army went into Russia and then they lost the war and Russian troops end up in Paris, somehow after end of that war, Russia end up occupying the entire Poland. The similar situation about the Russians in Alaska, I was under the impression that local Indians were thrilled to meet Russians and become Russian Orthodox, help building churches, and so Russians had no problem interacting with local Indians. There were really like hardly any skirmishes. That's, on the other side, when the Europeans were killing Indians left and right in Alaska and Aleutian Islands, everything was peaceful and happy because Russians were there. So just like Putin said that Russia painlessly absorbed the nations, that's what was taught in the Soviet schools. Okay, my friends, it's all I can tell you on this topic, and if I missed anything, please post your questions in the comment section. I'm more than happy to answer. Thank you for watching Ushanka Show, and please don't forget to like this video, maybe share with your friends, and we'll talk to you soon. До свидания, goodbye.